Hey, hello. Welcome back to the J Hutch Talks Too Much podcast or show. I'm still not sure what to call it, but regardless, we are back. And tonight we are talking about Canada's role in Ukraine. Again, if you are liking the stuff that we do here, if you're enjoying the content, please feel free to like the videos. If you haven't yet subscribed to J Hutch Talks Too Much, please feel free to subscribe. Oh, one thing I don't think I've mentioned at all yet so far is I think there's a bell. You can hit a bell on YouTube, and that will notify you when I have new content coming up or is up. So maybe hit that bell, because one thing is for certain: I've been very inconsistent with this podcast, but maybe that will change in the near future. If you are listening to this podcast, please feel free to rate the podcast, give it a review, and I think that's it in terms of the introductory material. So today I'm not entirely sure how long this is going to go for, but I was inspired to do a podcast on Ukraine after reading specifically one article in the Canadian Dimension Journal. As you'll see from the things that I talked about over the next little bit here in this podcast tonight, that a lot of my information, so certainly not all of it, but a lot of it does come from the journal Canadian Dimension, and I will certainly do my best to attribute it when I am liberally quoting from it. But yeah, I did want to talk about it because it did seem to me as if there, right from the beginning, there have been sort of troubling elements to me about the way that Canada has decided to be involved in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. And I'm not saying, or I won't say, in fact, that that Canada shouldn't be involved in any way. I would say, as I did in a previous video, that if they are going to be involved, they have to be very careful about the way they are going to be involved. And it does strike me that they're not being particularly careful about the way that they are involved in the conflict. So, from the beginning of the Russian invasion, which is undoubtedly and inarguably, I think, in my view, illegal under international law, it has been clear that the only really serious way that we in North America can help bring an end to what's going on in that area is to support and to strenuously urge diplomatic efforts. And here again, for those of you who are playing the drinking game at home, here is your opportunity to do so, because I'm going to be doing it yet again. As Noam Chomsky points out, and here I'm quoting, there's only one way to bring the conflict to an end. That's diplomacy. And he goes on to say that diplomacy, by definitions, means both sides accept it. They don't like it, but they accept it as the least bad option, which reminds me a little bit of a Larry David joke where he said, you know what a compromise is? A compromise is when both parties end up unhappy. In some ways, this is what Chomsky is suggesting here as well. Diplomacy means both sides accept it. They don't like it, but they accept it as the least bad option. And he goes on to describe what it might look like. He says it would offer Putin some kind of escape hatch. That's one possibility. He says the other possibility, though, if it's not going to be diplomacy, is to drag it out and see how much everybody will suffer, how many Ukrainians will die, how much Russia will suffer, how many millions of people will starve to death in Asia and Africa, how much we'll proceed towards heating the environment to the point where there will be no possibility for a livable human existence. Those are the two options. So it seems to me, and I agree with what Chomsky is saying here, it does seem to me that of those two options, diplomacy does seem like the best one. Now, a frequent response to this sort of argument that I do see is to say, well, in fact, the best way for the war to end is for Putin to stop his illegal invasion. And yeah, in fact, that is true. Now, there's a lot of things that we could say that about and make similar kinds of arguments. Like we could say, the one way to end world hunger is to feed people. Okay, that's true too. But in order for us to actually make a difference in terms of these two issues, we have to consider what it is that we ourselves can do. Now, a couple of weeks ago, some of you may have seen this already, and if you haven't seen it, I do urge you to watch it, to go into my videos, my back videos, and take a look at a video I did on Noam Chomsky and morality. And I discussed in that video, what does it mean to act morally? And I said that to act morally means to act on what we consider to be the predictable consequences of our actions. That comes right from Chomsky. What is it that we can do in order to make things better? So, for example, it's not moral by those standards, at least. It's not moral for anyone today to, say, condemn Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin or anything like that. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing to do that. In fact, it might very well, I think it is a good thing to say that, to condemn Hitler and Stalin's actions. Sure, it's a good thing, but it's not moral to do so. And the distinction is that condemning Hitler and Stalin in 2022 is a trivial exercise because it does exactly nothing to prevent the atrocities that they committed, right? If I talk about for hours upon hours today how bad Hitler was, it may very well be true, but it doesn't in any ways prevent anything that they actually did or undo anything that they did. To be truly moral, then, means to look at what we have control over and act on that. So in Canada, we have no control over what Vladimir Putin does. So it strikes me that the response to say that the way to really end things in terms of the illegal invasion of Ukraine is for Putin to stop the invasion may very well be true, but it doesn't have much to do with what we can do. We who are not in Russia. If you go back again to another video, and this is starting to sound like I'm just plugging all my old videos, and in a sense, I suppose that I am, but just for a moment, for another video that I did with Anders Bergstrom about political nuance, in that video, I do praise the Russian protesters, especially for their bravery, but just in general for the fact that they were protesting in Russia against the invasion, which in fact makes good moral sense for them to do. It's their, in many ways, moral responsibility to create that dissent and protest over the war in Russia. But we cannot put the same amount of pressure on Vladimir Putin as the people of Russia can. The question then is, what can we do to minimize the violence in the region, and what can we do to bring an end to the disaster? And again, in terms of what we can do, I think, is to push for a diplomatic solution. And it seems to me that it is this solution that is not being pursued by the Canadian government. Excuse me for a moment while I take a drink of my delicious beverage. So yeah, it does seem to me that Canada is not pursuing the diplomatic solution. Instead, they are pursuing the second strategy that Chomsky outlines in that quote that I read, namely to drag it out and see how much everybody will suffer. From the get-go, it became clear that the Canadian government was much more interested in increasing the violence in the region rather than pursuing diplomacy. At the time of the invasion, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland noted that the response by Canada and its allies to Russia will be swift and it will bite. A headline in the Toronto Star on March 9th cited Justin Trudeau stating that Putin will pay for war crimes he's committed in Ukraine. While, of course, once again, the war crimes are undeniable and should be condemned, this is hardly the rhetoric that one uses when one is pursuing a diplomatic solution. Now, since that time, as noted in a recent article in Canadian Dimension, Ottawa has delivered, here I'm quoting, Ottawa has delivered or allocated $600 million in heavy weaponry to repel Russian forces from the eastern region of Ukraine, known as the Donbass. Canadian assistance includes howitzers and light armored vehicles, as well as tens of thousands of artillery shells, grenades, and rocket launchers. The article also notes that Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, once again, is refusing to answer media questions about a New York Times report that Canada has deployed a special forces unit, meaning that the public is being kept in the dark about whether we are sending people to assist Ukrainian forces with training and intelligence gathering. Now, it's one thing, of course, for the Liberal Party to be making these sort of comments and taking these sort of stances. But to make matters worse, another article in the Canadian Dimension Journal revealed that even elements within Canada's most supposedly progressive political party, the NDP, are now being explicitly boastful about their refusal to engage in diplomacy. So, for example, Macron, the president of France, recently noted that, here I'm quoting from Macron, we must not humiliate Russia so that the day when the fighting stops, we can build an exit ramp through diplomatic means. Now, one NDP MP, Heather McPherson, responded in a tweet that Putin, quote, is not someone we should be negotiating with or humiliating. Now, this was an interesting quote to me because I don't know about you, but to me, and I think anyone who lived through the tumultuous decade of the early 2000s, the first 10 years of the 21st century, anyone who did that will get these flashes of similarly bold statements, especially coming from US leaders at the time, about their refusal to negotiate with terrorists. Note that in that case, that before 9/11, which was the reason why they were making these statements, the post 9/11 era. Before 9/11, terrorism had been declining in the United States. Now, after 9/11 is when you get that standard response from predominantly American politicians that we will not negotiate with terrorists. And as a result, as per an article by Megan Smith and Sean Ziegler, in the roughly 15 years since 9/11, and here again I'm quoting, the start of the global war on terror, the world experienced more civil and terrorist violence. So the fact of the matter is that this tactic of not negotiating doesn't seem to work historically. Certainly doesn't seem to minimize the violence. In fact, it happens at a time when the violence and terror are escalating. That members of the NDP are paraphrasing from the same ludicrously dangerous handbook is a testament to the hawkish state of even our most progressive leaders. And this isn't particularly surprising. So back in March, there was an agreement reached between the NDP party and the Liberal Party, essentially as a way to kind of counter conservative power. Now, this agreement, many would point out, and I would agree, gave the NDP party virtually nothing. As Martin Lukex pointed out, 22 of the 23 policies outlined in the agreement were either already Liberal promises, again, I'm quoting here, already Liberal promises, or modifications or extensions of them. So yeah, most of the promises, in fact, virtually all of the promises that were in the agreement were already Liberal promises. And on the other hand, though, the NDP gladly signed on to what Nora Loretta pointed out was a massive military boost with a recent pledge to spend $32 billion over several years. There's no doubt that the country is being led by hawkish interest and has been for quite a long time. I think one example in particular is a striking one. It's by no means the only one, but it is, I think, a good example to talk about for a few minutes, which is Canada's involvement with Venezuela over the last 5 years, which to me does demonstrate quite conclusively the hawkish stance that our leadership is taking. In 2017, Canada played a leading role in forming an organization called the Lima Group. And the goal of the Lima Group largely was to oust Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from power. Now, I do want to be clear on this. There's a variety of opinions among the left about Nicolas Maduro. Some will say he's good, some will say he's not good. I am not particularly on the side that says that he's good. I think that Venezuela kind of became a disaster under Maduro. I do disagree with the point that the failings of Venezuela are related in any way to socialism, which to me is kind of the propaganda line on why Venezuela fell apart. This is something that I can discuss further if anybody wants to discuss it, if anybody wants to leave a comment about it, or if anybody wants me to do a subsequent video about it. I don't think that Venezuela's disaster was a result of socialist economic policies. But it is the case, I would say, that Venezuela did make a very serious error in relying on a single export, namely oil, to drive their economy. And there's no doubt that Maduro himself was very corrupt as a leader. And yet, this doesn't support regime change campaigns against him. And I'll explain why in just a second. So why doesn't it justify regime change campaigns? Well, just again to draw back to a particular historical moment that I was a part of, back in 2003, early 2003, the U.S. had plans to invade Iraq. And me and most of my friends at the time, I would say, were opposed to the invasion. In fact, we took part in what was, at the time at least, and maybe still is the case, I'm not entirely sure, maybe somebody can check on this, but we took part in what was the largest protest against a war before the war had actually begun. In other words, there were certainly probably larger protests during the Vietnam War, but this was the largest protest that occurred that was anti-war before the war actually began. Now, those of us who opposed the invasion of Iraq didn't oppose it because we thought that Saddam Hussein was a great leader. In fact, I can remember anecdotally certain events from that time where the biggest response to, me saying I'm opposed to the invasion of Iraq, which you have to remember at the time was in fact a fairly unpopular position to hold, even in Canada. Many people, certainly as it got closer and closer to the invasion, were supporting it. So it was not necessarily an easy position to take in terms of the reactions that were against it. But that was a common response, which is, you think that Saddam Hussein's a good leader? You think he's done good things? What about all the bad things that he did? And you can't deny that. Of course, Saddam Hussein was a terrible leader, did terrible things. He was a monster in Iraq. He was a tyrant. We all knew that, when he ran for re-election in 2002 and received 100% of the vote, we all knew that that was a sham at the time, of course. But we were still opposed to the invasion, which was clearly, the cover for it at the time was Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, but it was really a regime change plan. And the fact of the matter is we were opposed to an outside country interfering with the affairs of another country. And in the case of Venezuela, from about 2017 to 2019, that's precisely what Canada was doing. Now, it wasn't invading the country. There is a difference. But they were, through various means, trying to oust Maduro from power. And I'll talk about that in a moment. These were largely led by the efforts by, and here's a name that has come up already a couple of times tonight, the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, who remains a crucial figure in the fight against Russia. And it should be noted that in the case of Maduro and in Venezuela, that while it is the case that Canada and many other countries refuse to acknowledge the legitimacy of the 2018 election, which brought Maduro back into power, there is in fact very little evidence to support the claim that the election was illegitimate. A significant fact that Dmitry Lascaris has pointed out, and this rarely gets reported, is that Maduro, in fact, called for there to be international monitors for the 2018 election. They called on the United Nations to observe the election, but the opposition parties pressured the United Nations not to come. Why did they pressure them not to come? Well, according to Dmitry Lascaris, they asked the United Nations to not send international monitors to monitor the election, because presence here would legitimize the election. So you could take of that what you will. Now, the fact is that their attempts to prevent the United Nations from coming, in fact, worked. The United Nations doesn't come. Nevertheless, as writer Steve Lalla points out, the voting system that Venezuela used in the election was, quote, approved by 150 international observers in 2018. Former United States President Jimmy Carter declared it to be the best in the world in 2012. And indeed, before the formation of the Lima Group, the Venezuelan voting system was widely acclaimed, even within the United States and in the countries that eventually formed the Lima Group. So largely the methods that were being used were widely supported. Now, Maduro ends up winning the election with almost 68% of the votes. And as Steve Lalla again points out, the losing candidates at the time all accepted the votes as valid. However, the electoral process, and one could say that you could see this coming a mile away, the electoral process was rejected by the European Union, the OAS, the Lima Group, and the United States. Now, am I suggesting that we could say with absolute certainty that there were no issues with the electoral process in Venezuela in 2018? No, I'm not saying that. Sure, it's quite possible that there were issues and problems, maybe outright widespread fraud, maybe. But what I am saying is that that's a maybe, and that the evidence certainly does not demonstrate that there were issues with it. And in fact, I think what is maybe a larger piece of compelling evidence is the fact that the international monitors were asked to not come by the opposition and were asked to come by Maduro. Moreover, the Lima Group, nevertheless, has been invested in regime change even before that election took place. They got together in 2017. As Yves Engler pointed out, Chrystia Freeland, in particular, repeatedly prodded the Caribbean and Central American countries to join the Lima Group's anti-Maduro efforts. And in 2017, she teamed Canada up with a slew of right-wing leaders in countries like Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, and Peru. Now, one of the ways that they went about their regime change, carrying out their regime change plan, was to coordinate harsh internationally imposed sanctions on Venezuela. Now, the sanctions that they did impose were condemned by the United Nations Human Rights Council, who noted, and here I'm quoting from the Human Rights Council, that such measures prevent the full realization of economic and social development of nations, and that those kind of sanctions disproportionately affect the poor and most vulnerable classes. So that's what they stood behind. In 2019, after the Maduro election, the Lima Group signed the Ottawa Declaration to remove Maduro from power and support the self-appointed Juan Guaido as leader. As Freeland put it at the time, the Lima Group was invested in stopping the human rights violations of the Maduro regime and expressing our shared commitment to a peaceful return to democracy. I'll let that quote sit for just a second. Yeah, so again, Freeland was saying that the Lima Group was invested in stopping the human rights violations of Maduro and expressing our shared commitment to a peaceful return to democracy. And in fact, we should certainly praise Freeland's overwhelming commitment to democracy and human rights, which for her entails teaming up with countries such as the ultra right wing neo fascist Brazil and a country like Honduras, which at the time was described by Amnesty International as one of the most dangerous countries in the Americas region for human rights defenders, all to oust what all evidence seemed to suggest was a democratically elected leader, and instead to support someone who simply declared himself to be a leader. I dare you to find a more compelling commitment to democracy and human rights than that. That's downright democratic, I think. So it should be said that the Canadian government at the time did try to give a reason to justify their support of self-appointed Juan Guaido, noting that Article 233 of the Venezuelan Constitution supported it. But again, according to Dimitri Lascaris, Article 233 suggests that in Venezuela, the president of the National Assembly can become the president on an interim basis in 6 specific circumstances. Now, Trudeau appealed to precisely this article in his support for Guaido, but notably did not note what the 6 specific circumstances were, because doing so, Lascaris notes, would have revealed that none of them applied to this scenario. And if you want, I can point you to the article where Lascaris runs through all 6 circumstances and does demonstrate exactly the case that none of those 6 circumstances applied to this case. To give Trudeau the benefit of the doubt, it's quite possible he never read Article 233, or if he did, he didn't understand it. But nevertheless, it did not justify on any grounds supporting this interim leader. The Lima Group's efforts in Venezuela are nicely summed up in an article by Steve Lala, who quotes Venezuelan sociologist Maria Paez Victor, who stated, "Unable to get the Organization of American States votes needed to agree to their nefarious plot, this group of governments, with no official international standing, few democratic principles, most led by known discredited leaders, allied itself through all of its diplomatic and economic support behind diplomatic and economic support behind a man who self-proclaimed himself president of Venezuela in a public plaza, violating the country's constitution and all electoral rules. So much," Victor says, "for the respect for the rule of law that the Canadian Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland so frequently spouts." Now, it is in fact worth pointing out that the Lima Group largely fell apart as the countries involved began to rid themselves of their extreme right-wing leaders and then pulled out of the group. For example, as the journal Jacobin reported, here I'm quoting, after Pedro Castillo, a left-wing politician, won the presidential election in Peru, Peruvian Foreign Affairs Minister Hector Bayar called the Lima Group, quote, "the most disastrous thing we have done in international politics in the history of Peru." This, of course, is contrary to the position of Canada's National Post, who in an op-ed declared the Lima Group to be Venezuela's best hope. At any rate, the same administration who carried all of this out in the Lima Group are now engaged in Ukraine, shutting down the possibility of diplomacy and increasing the violence in the region. Now, diplomacy is, of course, still possible, though it becomes less possible as time goes on. Here, I'm just going to take another quick drink of my beverage. And again, if anybody has any comments or any points, please feel free to leave them. I'd be happy to engage with them. So what does diplomacy look like when Chomsky says, or I suggest, that diplomacy is the answer, what does that mean? Well, there are a couple of things that could be done. So one figure, Scott Ritter, recently suggested that Russia's goal all along has been to get Europe to agree to, here I'm quoting, to a renegotiated European security framework that would include new arms control agreements that prohibit intermediate nuclear forces, that get rid of anti-ballistic missile sites in Poland and Romania, and seeks to remove tactical nuclear weapons from Europe altogether. Now, I have to say, that seems fairly reasonable, especially if it also paves the way towards Russia disarming, which I do think would be a vital component of that discussion. Now, obviously, there's that, but obviously there is NATO, Ukraine's role in NATO as a significant hinge point. I said this on the last show that I did where this was a topic, but it bears some repeating, that it was understood as far back as the 90s that the incorporation of Ukraine into NATO would be understood as an act of provocation, that Russia would understand it as an act of provocation. Now, a frequent response to this, and you see it every single time that this comes up, so I'm sure you won't be surprised to see it, but a frequent response to that is to say that Ukraine has every right to join NATO. Now, that is true. And again, of course, nothing justifies Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It is illegal. It should not be justified. So it certainly doesn't justify the invasion to suggest that Ukraine joined NATO. But we can't, I don't think, deny the fact that they were provoked. Now, those of you might not know, or some people in the audience might not know this, but back in the days of the Cold War, and remember that NATO was established specifically to prevent Soviet expansion. It was a Cold War organization that was built up to prevent Soviet expansion, which means by its own definition, by its own makeup, there was no reason for NATO at all to exist after the Soviet Union collapsed. But it went on. And during the Cold War, there was a sort of Soviet version of NATO that was called the Warsaw Pact. Now, this is just a totally hypothetical scenario, but I do think that it's well worth thinking about. So suppose at the height of Cold War tensions, now there's a few moments that you could pick, but let's say somewhere around the period of the Bay of Pigs, that Mexico decides that it will join the Warsaw Pact. So somewhere, in the early 1960s, Mexico decides it will join the Warsaw Pact. As a result of this, the Soviet Union begins to train military forces inside of Mexico. Then a few days after that, roughly around the same time, Canada decides that it will also join the Warsaw Pact. And again, the Soviet Union begins to flood Canada with weapons and spends millions of dollars training the military there. Now, at this point, then, the United States would be surrounded by countries that have made deals with their official enemy and who are being consistently trained by that enemy and supplied with weapons by them. Now, the question first we can ask is, would Canada and Mexico have had the right to have done that? I think so. As far as I know, they would have had the right to do that. And then the question after that becomes, would the fact that Mexico and Canada joining the Warsaw Pact and being flooded with weapons and being trained militarily by them, would that have decreased the possibility of a violent U.S. response? Would it have not had any impact at all on the possibility of a violent U.S. response? Or would it have increased the possibility of a violent U.S. response? And once you've asked yourself that question, if the United States had responded to this with violence, would the U.S. media at the time have said that the Soviet Union bears no responsibility for the U.S.'s violent response whatsoever? Would that have been the claim that they've made? Because keep in mind, people like Chrystia Freeland argues that, and here I'm quoting her directly, Russia is directly and solely responsible for the invasion, the illegal invasion of Ukraine and its economic consequences. Now, this, incidentally, is in contradiction to the majority of Ukrainians, 58% of whom say that the US has borne some or a great deal of responsibility for the war, and 55% said as much for NATO. There I'm quoting. So 58% of Ukrainians say that the US bears some responsibility. 55% say that NATO bears some responsibility. Chrystia Freeland says that Russia is directly and solely responsible. This is not surprising. Ukraine's response, at least, is not surprising, given the fact that Ukraine voted Zelensky into power by a great majority, I think something like 70% of the vote, on the basis of his call for peace in the region. That was his platform. He was the peace leader, and he was ushered in a wave of great support. And then the people of Ukraine watched as he slowly became more and more pressured by outside forces like the United States to reject or walk away from that peace plan. But it is, of course, part and parcel of the Trudeau cabinet's understanding of democracy that their support of Ukraine means specifically disagreeing with the positions that the majority of Ukrainians take on the issue. Ultimately, given the makeup of our current leadership, it would be unthinkable for our leaders to question NATO. As Canadian Dimension reported, Canadian military trainers have repeatedly said, here again I'm quoting, that one of their aims was to pave the way for full Ukrainian participation in NATO by making its forces interoperable with the rest of the alliance. And another Canadian Dimension article notes how the NDP has a very pro-NATO stance, noting Heather McPherson's unequivocal support for the recent move by Sweden and Finland and their bid for membership in NATO. McPherson was also suggesting that the NDP in general, not just her, but the NDP, was calling on all NATO members to approve Sweden and Finland's application as quickly as possible. Now, it's worth considering what the NDP is doing when it's explicitly calling for the expansion of NATO. Well, what is NATO? What do they do? Chris Hedges has recently stated that NATO is the most dangerous military alliance on the planet, pointing to the fact, and here I'm quoting from Hedges, that NATO bombed Bosnia, Serbia, and Kosovo. It launched wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Libya, resulting in close to 1 million deaths and some 38 million people driven from their homes. It has backed Turkey, with NATO's second largest military, which has illegally invaded and occupied parts of Syria as well as Iraq. In exchange for Turkey's President Erdogan's permission for Finland and Sweden to join the NATO alliance, the two Nordic countries have agreed to expand their domestic terror laws, making it easier to crack down on Kurdish and other activities, lift their restrictions on selling arms to Turkey, and deny support to the Kurdish-led movement for democratic autonomy in Syria. So again, when Heather McPherson is calling on NATO members to approve the application of Sweden and Finland as quickly as possible, that is what she is calling for. Because they have to make that agreement in order to join NATO. Again, expand their domestic terror laws, making it easier to crack down on Kurdish and other activities, lift their restriction on selling arms to Turkey, and deny support to the Kurdish-led movement for democratic autonomy in Syria. Hedges then points to a recent NATO report called NATO 2030, Unified for a New Era. The report, Hedges notes, reveals that NATO sees the future as a battle for hegemony with rival states, especially China, and calls for the preparation of prolonged global conflict. So this is what our Canadian government and even our most supposedly progressive elements within it are suggesting should be supported and should be expanded. Not only supported, but expanded. But again, this should come as no surprise when you look at the government's past foreign policy endeavors. The idea that Canada is looking towards peaceful solutions to the conflict in Ukraine is unfortunately not a reality whatsoever, and there's no sign that any of the political parties appear to be fighting for it. In that case, as always, the solution is in the hands of the people, who can put pressure on the government to reverse its long-standing policy of fostering geopolitical instability and instead support a resolution that decreases the level of violence in the world. Thanks. Take care.